Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk about the Idaho 4 case. Now, I was going to begin talking about the Bryan Sheath disappearance today, but we're going to save that for my next video, and we'll definitely get into that because it's going to be very, very interesting. So stay tuned for that video. But some new documents came out yesterday in the Idaho 4 case. So today, we need to talk about this knife sheath, the DNA, and everything that goes along with it. Now, I'll be honest, when I first heard that Bryan Kohberger's DNA was found inside the crime scene on the accessory to the weapon that law enforcement believed that he used to carry out these crimes, my first thought was that he's done. Bryan Kohberger is done. He left his DNA inside a crime scene on the accessory to the weapon that he used. That's a pretty tough hurdle to get over. Now, I'm thinking, by the way that the media is reporting this, that this is solid, definitive DNA, that this is blood or this is hair. And I'm thinking that they have a lot more of it than just a speck of dust. So as more information is coming out, we began learning what type of DNA was actually found on this knife sheath. We began to find out that it wasn't really a whole lot. It was smaller than a speck of dust. And we also began learning about the goose chase that investigators had to go through just in order to use this DNA. When I first started hearing about the DNA, of course, I'm thinking there must be other evidence to back up the DNA that was found on this knife sheath. Because if not, then all you have is a knife sheath with some touch DNA on it. There needs to be something to back that up. You know, I'm thinking that now we've got this knife sheath with touch DNA, so we should have a motive, a connection, how this all happened to back up this knife sheath. But we don't have that. So far, we don't have a motive. Why Bryan Kohberger would have even wanted to commit these crimes. We don't have a connection between Bryan Kohberger and anyone inside this house. And we don't know how one person got into the King Roadhouse and committed these crimes. So all we have right now is this knife sheath with the touch DNA. We don't know how it got there. This knife sheath could have gotten there a million different ways. I mean, it could have been brought in by Bryan Kohberger if he is the person who committed these crimes. It could have been brought in by friends, people who know the people who live in this house, or it could have already been inside the house. This knife could have been owned by someone who lived at the house, maybe kept it around for protection, for home defense. So right now, we don't know where this knife sheath came from. And more importantly, we don't know where the knife is that goes to this knife sheath. So we don't even know that this is the knife that was used to carry out these crimes. In my opinion, if this knife sheath had, let's say, blood on it, then that's a pretty good indication that this knife sheath was involved in this crime. But being that it only has touch DNA on the button snap of the knife sheath and no real evidence to back it up, no motive, no connection, no weapon that was used to carry out the crimes, then, I mean, all they have really is a knife sheath. There's no real story behind it. So, in my opinion, this knife sheath doesn't really prove 100% that Bryan Kohberger was inside this house. It just proves that a knife sheath that Bryan Kohberger possibly touched at some point was inside this house. Without knowing where this knife sheath came from, it makes things really difficult because you don't know if this knife sheath was already inside the house, if it was brought in by the attacker, or, if maybe one of the friends just brought it over that morning when they were called over mid-morning by Dylan and Bethany. At first, this knife sheath, along with the DNA, seemed like solid evidence. Bryan Kohberger left his DNA on a knife sheath inside the crime scene. I mean, that's pretty cut and dry. But as information began coming out and the hearings began, it started to look, in my opinion, like these agencies, the feds, were doing things that seemed a little sneaky. It seemed as though they weren't doing things by the book. They weren't doing things on the up and up. And I think that's when a lot of us became suspicious because, you're law enforcement. You should be doing things the way that they're supposed to be done. So why all of the smoke and mirrors? Why does everything seem so sneaky? And I think that that's when a lot of us began really looking into the knife sheath evidence because it didn't seem like they had a clear path to how they got to Bryan Kohberger from this knife sheath. It seemed like they got this knife sheath and then they found this DNA, this touch DNA. They ran it through CODIS and couldn't find anything. So they decided to run it through genetic genealogy. And that's when everything started getting very shady, in my opinion. If you follow my Idaho 4 videos, then you already know that I believe that there was more than one attacker in the King Roadhouse that night. I believe that there was more than one weapon. In my opinion, there were multiple weapons used in this crime. Now, back in the beginning, before law enforcement even had a suspect, Steve Gonsalves did an interview and he talked about how the means of death between Kaylee and Maddie did not match. And when he's talking to this reporter, you can just see it in his face that what he's about to say is important, or he feels like it's an important piece of information. And what he says is that Kaylee and Maddie's means of death do not match, that their wounds did not match at all, not even close. So I don't feel like Steve Gonsalves was trying to say that the same weapon can make a variety of different wounds. And I don't think that he was trying to say that whoever this individual was that committed the crime could make the wounds look different with the same weapon. I think what Steve Gonsalves was trying to say is that the wounds were not consistent. The wounds between Kaylee and Maddie did not match, which would be a good indication that there was more than one attacker, or at least more than one weapon used. As I said before, it's very possible that this knife sheath could have belonged to someone who lived inside this house. That might explain why the sheath itself is just laying on the bed. Because I don't believe that whoever committed these crimes walked into the house with the knife sheath still on the knife and then took it off when he got to his victims and then dropped it right next to two of the victims. I don't believe that happened. I don't believe that someone who could go into a house and take 4 people's lives with a knife in a very, very short amount of time and get away without being identified or without getting injured themselves would make that type of mistake. I mean, if this intruder walked into the house with the knife sheath in his hand, then he knows that he's going to have to drop that knife sheath because he doesn't have a free hand. So he doesn't have a hand to manipulate his victims. So if he walks into this house and he's carrying this knife sheath with this knife, he already knows that he's going to have to drop that knife sheath. Now, there's also the possibility that this knife belonged to Kaylee or Maddie, and maybe they pulled it out in self-defense, and it was taken away from them and used against them. Now, something else that Steve talked about was that he allegedly spoke to a detective that told him that this weapon that was used would have been the type of weapon that this attacker was proud of, something that this attacker spent some money on. So basically that this weapon was this attacker's prized possession. Now, does that sound like a K-bar? I mean, a K-bar is a good, solid utility knife. But I would hardly believe that it would be someone's prized possession. And definitely not something that someone would feel was extremely expensive. I mean, you can pick up a K-bar knife, a new K-bar, on Amazon for $100. You could probably pick one up at a surplus store for $50. So K-bar knives are a dime a dozen. They're not really the type of weapon that I would think would be someone's prized possession. So was this detective describing a K-bar knife, or was he describing a different type of weapon? Another reason that I believe that there were multiple weapons used to carry out the Idaho 4 crimes is because Steve Gonsalves came out and said that the coroner told him that there was one hell of a battle going on down there. Now, when I think of one hell of a battle, I'm thinking of multiple people fighting. I'm thinking of multiple people battling. I'm not thinking of 4 people asleep in their beds who get snuck up on. You know, I'm thinking of fighting. I'm thinking of battling. And when I hear one hell of a battle, to me, that sounds like multiple people. So in my opinion, I do feel like there were multiple people involved in these crimes. Now, getting back to the knife sheath. You know, the knife sheath to me almost seems symbolic. Because if you look at the sheath, it's very recognizable. You're not going to mistake what type of knife goes in that knife sheath. I mean, it says K-bar right on the front. It says USMC, and it has the eagle, globe, and anchor. So it's very recognizable. I mean, you're not going to mistake that this knife sheath belongs to a K-bar knife. The question is, where is the knife that goes inside the sheath? Now, we know that investigators processed this knife sheath that they found inside the crime scene. And we know that these crimes were carried out with a sharp-edged object. So it makes me wonder if investigators did DNA testing on all of the sharp objects inside the house. All of the kitchen knives, scissors, stuff like that. If they tested and processed everything that was sharp inside that house. Because like I said from the very beginning, if Bryan Kohberger's touch DNA would not have been on the accessory to a weapon, and it had just been, let's say, on a Solo cup or, you know, on a paper plate, then it likely would have never been found. But because it was on the accessory to a weapon is why that touch DNA was found. I'm sure that there was a ton of touch DNA inside that house, inside the kitchen, inside the bathrooms. With as many people as were going in and out of that house, I'm sure there was DNA all over that house, you know? So, I mean, if someone was going to plant evidence, and I'm not saying that's what happened, I'm just saying if someone was going to plant evidence, a recognizable knife sheath would be ideal because you already know the weapon that this knife sheath goes to. You know that it goes to a K-bar knife. And you also know that these victims' lives were taken with a knife. So, of course, any evidence that's on this knife sheath is going to stand out like a beacon in the night. So that's how they came across Bryan Kohberger's DNA, because if it was anywhere else in that house, they likely would have never found it. So here's another question. Do we know for sure that a K-bar knife was even used in these crimes? We don't know that because we don't know where this knife sheath came from. So we don't know 100% that a K-bar knife was used to carry out these crimes. We just know that there's a knife sheath on Maddie's bed. So without the story around it, without the motive, without the connection, without the actual weapon, all we really have is a knife sheath that has touch DNA on it. So when I first heard about this DNA that they found on this knife sheath, automatically I believed that there would be some evidence to back that all up, something to pull it all together. But so far, we haven't seen that. So far, we don't have a motive. So far, we haven't seen any connections. And we don't have a weapon, as far as we know. Now, one thing that I do want to say is that I really do not want to see anyone get off on a technicality. Not someone who has taken other people's lives. And I don't want to see Bryan Kohberger. If Bryan Kohberger is the individual who committed these crimes and the prosecution is able to lay that all out for us and show us the proof, then I definitely do not want him to get off on a technicality. He deserves to be held accountable. The victims deserve that. The families of the victims deserve that. So by no means, when we talk about, this questionable DNA, am I trying to say that I think Bryan Kohberger should be let off easy? Because that's not what I'm saying at all. If Bryan Kohberger is the individual who committed these crimes, then he deserves to pay the price for that. We want a fair trial. I want Bryan Kohberger to get a fair trial. But I also don't want to see someone who could have possibly taken 4 people's lives get off on a technicality. So when I'm saying that this DNA is questionable, I'm just talking about from what I see. It looks sketchy. It doesn't look like solid evidence. It looks like something that was possibly fabricated. And I'm not saying that it was. I'm just saying what it looks like. I think a lot of times people believe that those of us that believe we haven't seen enough evidence to convict Bryan Kohberger are on his team. Like, we're on his side. We're rooting for Bryan Kohberger. And I can say for myself, that's definitely not the case. If I saw solid evidence that proved that Bryan Kohberger committed these crimes, then we would be having a totally different conversation. It's not really about choosing sides. It's about believing what we're seeing with our own eyes. It just seems like when you have all of these agencies working together, you have the feds working with state police, working with local police, working with outside experts, stuff like that. It seems like this investigation would be a lot more organized. It seems like there would be a clear path to how law enforcement got to Bryan Kohberger. Why Bryan Kohberger was charged with these crimes. It seems like by now, over 2 years later, we would have some sort of definitive evidence that Bryan Kohberger committed these crimes. But right now, all we have is this knife sheath with this touch DNA that was found inside the crime scene. And is that, a heavy piece of evidence? Absolutely. But there's no evidence, in my opinion, to pull it all together. We just have this knife sheath inside this crime scene that could have come from anywhere. This touch DNA could have come from outside of the house and been brought into the house by someone who was not Bryan Kohberger. So, in my opinion, if this is all of the evidence, if this is the star of the show, if this is their key piece of evidence, then it seems as though there should be information and other evidence to support it, rather than just having this knife sheath that could have come from anywhere. It's going to be interesting how they present this knife sheath all by itself. It's just a knife sheath that was found inside the crime scene with Bryan Kohberger's touch DNA on it. So I'm going through more of these documents, and we're going to talk about some of the information that came out in these new documents. But today I wanted to talk about this knife sheath because there's a lot of talk about the IgG. And I think the knife sheath is what leads a lot of people to believe whether Bryan Kohberger did commit this crime or he did not. I think a lot of it rests on this knife sheath. So it's going to be interesting to see how this is presented at trial. Now that we know, all of the evidence will be presented. And to be honest, I wouldn't really want to have it any other way. No matter how complicated this case gets, what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. So let's look at all of the evidence, and that will give us the truth. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I hope that you had an amazing day today. We'll see you next time.